first met Anne Morales on an Amtrak headed toward Chicago, far from her home in a sense, and rapidly approaching my own in another sense. She appeared on a screen balanced precariously on my knees while digging through my backpack for a blue Monster energy drink that tasted like the color blue. Anne Morales is a native of Tropico, a small simulated island nation where she works on one of the large sugar plantations. Miss Morales lives at the bunkhouse with a mix of fellow plantation hands and laborers from the neighboring factory. She has happiness levels on the lower side of moderate, as indicated by the various meters that follow her around, hovering like mobile halos somewhere to her right. The meters display measurements of happiness in terms of food, healthcare, fun, faith, housing, jobs, liberty, crime, and safety. Her overall happiness is still higher than average among Tropicans. It was a difficult year in terms of both crop yields and pirates. Sadly, Miss Morales apparently harbors some revolutionary sympathies, and I made a mental note to remember to keep an eye on her. Sometime later, I met another Tropican, Hugo Hernandez, a recent immigrant who, like Anne Morales, unfortunately arrived with revolutionary political leanings. It'd be fair to say Mr. Hernandez felt antagonistically towards the state, and thereby me personally, the player, from the moment he arrived on the shores of Tropico several in-game years or real-time minutes ago. However, after a button marked bribe was clicked and a brief animation played on screen, Mr. Hernandez changed his tune. Accessible via an on-screen menu, his thoughts, which once went something like, "It's a day at least," quickly shifted to declaring a golden age following his motivational gift from me, the president. I paused the world and napped. It was time to take a break from the pressures of governance. Such is the life of an average Tropican. Such is the life inside the video game. You operate mostly unseen until you become a problem. Then, following a handful of clicks, gently and not so gently, you are made to no longer be a problem. This is what the experience of being Tropican must feel like, to be made to do, and that is what the experience of playing Tropico 6 feels like, to make do. It is what the experience of the video game feels like. Tropico 6 is a political simulation video game, the most recent in a series of political simulation games, where gameplay consists of managing a network of interrelated systems to ensure the relative prosperity of the island nation of Tropico. Tropico is populated by procedurally generated Tropicans, who respond to the decisions players make over the course of the game. These decisions manifest through the various in-game management systems, setting up plantations to grow the local economy, developing industry, founding educational institutions, forming social organizations, designing transportation systems, negotiating trade contracts, researching new technologies, and navigating complex social relationships with a number of political factions. Decisions the player makes via clicking buttons from a central hub and various on-screen prompts impact the individual Tropicans differently depending on their political affiliations, professions, education levels, interpersonal relationships, etc. Some policies may increase their happiness, boosting the player's favorability ratings at the polls, while others may decrease productivity, grinding coal mining to an almost halt. The actual gameplay looks more like graphs, maps, and blueprints than other traditional games or leisure activities. Tropico 6's publisher, Calypso Media, describes the video game as a chance to, quote, prove yourself as a feared dictator or peace-loving statesman on the island state of Tropico, and shape the very fate of your own Banana Republic through 4 distinct eras. Your very own Banana Republic is a pretty explicit reflection of the overall tone of the game, a sort of eye roll or nudge nudge or wink wink or whatever, while at the exact same time reinforcing that which one is rolling their eyes at. In Tropico 6, the player plays as El Presidente, the generic leader of the generic island, though clearly modeled on Fidel Castro and clearly set on a Caribbean island. El Presidente has complete control over all construction, management, and political positioning of each and every facet of life on the island of Tropico, and of each and every facet of the lives of each Tropican. The central hub from which the player selects commands and orders various actions is called up with the press of a button. Each of these procedural actions influence individual Tropicans, and Tropicans is a larger social group. Each 10-year period, there is an election, and the overall satisfaction of the citizenry is required to continue the game. In other words, the player loses the game if El Presidente loses the election. Alternately, A player just could invest in more military barracks and security checkpoints, schedule more armed patrols, or cancel the election entirely. Playing Tropico 6 is, in essence, managing very large-scale systems and witnessing the smaller-scale effects, which then feed back into those larger systems, and so on and so on. Over the minutes, I've gotten to know two other Tropicans. Nora Vasquez is 33. She describes herself as a big fan of surfing. She lives in one of Tropico's dozens of shacks with her beloved husband, Hugo. No relation to the other Hugos, the game can only come up with so many names, it would seem. After receiving her state-sponsored education, Ms. Vasquez found work in the local factory, behaved, and did quite well for herself. I checked in on her over the years, but was mostly preoccupied with agricultural catastrophe elsewhere. Even when the player is not paying attention, Tropicans continue to go about their processes, their lives, working, sleeping, organizing, procreating, dying, etc. Their lives are not dependent on the focus of the player. Unfortunately for Ms. Vasquez, her husband later joined that revolutionary faction, who were gaining ground in an upcoming election. He was therefore summarily executed in the street in the middle of the afternoon. To kill Hugo Vasquez, I simply clicked a button marked kill and watched a brief animation. The whole bleak ordeal was less of an assassination and more of selecting from a menu at a fast food restaurant. The implication perhaps being that the state apparatus operates with a similarly withdrawn fast food gaze when deciding who lives and dies. The choice is easy to perform and easy to justify, the elimination of several pixels in effort to preserve the overall equilibrium of the system, aka winning the next election and the game. The completely detached nature of choosing who lives and dies with a click, rather than causing an internal moral crisis on the part of the player, is something more like fun. It is quite literally gaming, and it looks a whole lot like governing. The absolute primacy of procedures, of rules, as a means of expression in the video game, lends itself to the construction of closed systems, completely fictional worlds with their own languages, figures, and physics. Because these worlds are presumed totally withdrawn from our own, often the assumptions they are based on remain hidden beneath the surface. But the rules come from somewhere, even when the game presents its systems as novel or without origin in the ordinary world. Sometimes, however, a video game makes intentional connections to the real, expands its universe with the inclusion of a variation of our own. As is the case with Tropico 6, the game is imbued with reference and aesthetics ripped from a Caribbean post-colonial reality, reconfigured through procedural operations, systematized, created an explicit conversation between the internal world of the game and the external world of the world. And maybe it is this historical gap between the known events outside the world of the game and the events as they unfold internally that generates the discourse that players interrogate through play. Back in the game, I clicked on Pablo Gutierrez, a kid in the local elementary school and a fan of soccer and staunch critic of the sanitation system. Not much else is known of young Pablo. He vanished. For real, I couldn't find him again moments after I clicked on something else. Whether he drowned or met his fate via procedural glitch is unknown. Sometimes things just sort of disappear in Tropico 6. His case is still under investigation. The separation between the internal world of the video game and the external world of the real is at most a mirage. Tropico 6 is not only a video game, it's a simulation video game. Rather than providing a player with a set of goals to be accomplished within limitations, these games give the player access to the limitations themselves. Simulation games give the player tools. It is not operating in a fictional world as much as it is building that fictional world. It's not pretending. Pretending leaves the principle of reality intact. But simulation threatens the difference between the real and the imaginary. We aren't being presented an alternative history lesson, as these simulation games, rather than present information, provide tools for inventing worlds. These tools are essentially management systems for regulating health, happiness, productivity, organizing industry, rerouting traffic, arranging for trade agreements with foreign powers, interlocking parts and behaviors. But the world is also made of interlocking parts and behaviors. Video games are a model of the real inside of the real, not a pretend space contained, separated from reality. The models of the game are not based on models in the real. They are those models, and we are at all times in danger of forgetting. Simulations in some form predate their technoludic manifestation at least since used in military training exercises in Prussia. The gamified versions of my real focus began in earnest in the 1960s, when simulations and related advances in computer technology were nurtured by government grants for both military and domestic policy purposes. These programs had serious practical applications outside of their computers, as since the close of World War II, engineers and corporate managers were using simulations to design and run power grids, telecommunication networks, factories, and businesses. The rules of the simulation gave birth to the rules of the real world, not the other way around. The rules that govern the video game, the way it can be played, and the outcomes are not so much a reflection of the rules that govern capital, world markets, and geopolitics. They are those forces. The experience of playing the simulation is one of being submerged in a deluge of constantly changing data in maps and graphs showing the population growth and density, unemployment, power and water supplies, crime, traffic, congestion, pollution, etc., etc. The simulation video game does not instruct so much as it implicates. It forces the player to make a choice and to bear the weight of the responsibility of that choice, a weight that becomes embodied outside of the game, in the player, in the world, and perhaps thereby generates a kind of simulated empathy. Another member of the digitized citizenry, Alba Martinez, works for me, for the state, for El Presidente, for the player. She can usually be found on her patrol, keeping guard at the local dungeon. The citizenry had been behaving particularly disobediently for several months, and I had intended to set an example with Miss Martinez to arrange for her to have an unfortunate accident. But fortunately for her, I'd forgotten to construct a Ministry of Information and was therefore unable to execute the command. Unfortunately for Miss Martinez, constructing the ministry was a matter of 4 button pushes. The world of simulation, the world of Tropico 6, the world of the Tropicans, is not so much the Caribbean as it is the Caribbean. But the distinction between video game and real is less clear than it first appears. The similarities between the simulation and the simulated can even further be found in the mechanics of the games themselves, in the rules, the procedures, the tools with which the game is played. So beneath the surface level simulation of urban development and local governance are the same mechanisms government think tanks use to formulate policy. The interior of the video game is some sort of third space, real and imagined, consequences that seem to slip through the unusual borders of the real. So these procedures, the sum of which is the experience of actually playing the game, the sum of which is also the world of Tropico, loosely resemble the procedurality of real political structures. It's the use of power or bureaucracy. Procedures, fixed, systemic ways of doing things, are tied to authority, crafted from the top down, and put in place to structure behavior and identify infringement. These procedures decree how something can or can't happen, the process by which something is permitted, in other words. So in-game, the player clicks a mouse and makes a selection, just as the executioner points at the next in line for the guillotine. Procedures implicate the one doing the proceeding in the game and in the world. They are entwined with our politics, with our state-sponsored violence, with law enforcement. Consider the police officer or army private who carries out a clearly unethical action, but later offers the defense, "I was following procedure." Procedures, like simulations themselves, present a phony neutrality, an imaginary distance between simulated and real, the actor and the action. They mask the agency of actors, they hide the choices humans make, the material consequences of these choices, and the pleasures of choosing. Ian Bogos defines procedural rhetoric as, quote, "a practice of using processes persuasively." It's a technique for making arguments with computational systems for unpacking other computational arguments. In other words, video games make their argument. They communicate something via processes, via the rules and mechanics of the game. So video games are dynamic. They can unpack large geopolitical systems because they are systems themselves. The video game is a whole environment for the representation of colonial discourse. An essential aspect of this colonial discourse is its dependence on the concept of fixity. As a sign of cultural, historical, racial difference, it connotes a rigidity as well as disorder and degeneracy. Like the stereotype functions in colonial discourse, fixed in its repetition, the procedures beneath the surface of the video game give the appearance of guaranteed outcomes, even though the actions of the player in managing those systems creates anything but a fixed set of conditions that could be called a win. Video games represent process with process. The video game speaks for no one because it does not speak exactly. The video game does not need to speak as computation is representation. Not only are the systems made visible via procedural representation, which could also be true of other forms of representation, but we can play with them. Procedural forms have their own figures and tropes, even kinds of player actions, even ways of interacting like clicking or sliding or scrolling are in a sense the metaphor and metonymy of procedural objects like video games. In the video game, objects aren't the main signifier doing the signifying exactly. The actions are. The effects of procedural rhetoric are not contained to the video game itself, for if it is the real of representation that constitutes the space of the political, then rather than mere processes, these representations are the processes themselves. These models create material effects. Now, engaging with a set of systems that are responsible for the material impacts of global neocolonial policy or neoliberal globalization does not automatically imply validation for the behavior of the game models. Video games can also allow players to empathize with people and situations they might not ordinarily encounter. But this opportunity to empathize is not without problems, especially in the case of Tropico 6. While there is an opportunity in the form to put us in someone else's shoes, most of the time these shoes are bigger than our own. We do not play as a Tropican, we play as El Presidente. The player must play as state power, and that experience is of course hollow. El Presidente is a simulated fleshy container for the set of operating systems that actually govern. In some sense, when we play video games, we resemble children clopping around in their parents' loafers or pumps. We are play acting at power. This is less an act of resistance than an act of reinforcement. To play act behavior is to reproduce that behavior. It has gotten to the point that some of the physical mechanics of warfare, as with US drone strikes, are exactly the same physical mechanics of gameplay. Soldiers in a sense arrive to boot camp, in a sense already trained. Although the player ostensibly plays a dictatorial role, the player wields no real power. Every choice is chosen within a set of pre-established parameters. The outcome of any given action is a given, even if it remains hidden from the player. The appearance of randomness is not randomness. While the player can carry out various actions, the problem is that activity is not the same as agency. For example, a player may wish to play peacefully to avoid violence, but the extermination plan is itself already rigidly determined. The player may have the choice to kill any one of 5 aliens first, but nevertheless must kill all 5 before progressing. One may be able to choose when, how, or what to kill, but one must kill before moving on to the next stage. Of course, in our case more specifically, when one kills a Tropican, one does not kill an actual human being, but a simulation of a human, something somehow less than. To kill in game, as much of human history, is justified, because those one kills are understood to be less than oneself. I propose that it is the same neocolonial gaze, that the player looks at the Tropicans, the citizens, the aliens, that colonizers first gazed from their ships at the future colonized on the shore. The model of the human itself was achieved through the epistemic invention of imperial and colonial differences. The colonizers deemed themselves human, all others as some sort of subspecies. The human, the colonizer, ordered, rational, gendered, sexed, European, needs the other from which to distinguish itself, and this other is somehow always less. A new simulated geometry of the line, an episteme used by the human to distinguish itself from the other. The player deems themselves, or is deemed human, all others some sort of simulation species, a reproduction of a reproduction, expendable. And it's through this reproduction that the simulation crosses the modernist boundary into the realm of the real, a virtual material experience. When we speak of the in-game characters, these statements are perhaps half real, since it may describe both a fictional entity and the actual rules of the game. When we speak of Tropicans, we are speaking of a fictional people, but we are also talking about real pixels that we directly interact with by pressing buttons. And these button presses are the simulation, the program, used for play, and simultaneously for the enforcement of state power. The play of Tropico 6 is the real exercising of state power. It is with the same colonizing gaze that present-day simulators, governments, agencies, think tanks attempt to make the real, all the real, coincide with their models of simulation. Perhaps these simulations don't merely resemble the capitalist and colonial structures of domination. They directly instantiate them and train human beings to become part of those systems. Video games aren't merely representations of oppression. They are the very systems doing the oppressing, training new oppressors new techniques to oppress with. The players are training to wield the exact same procedural tools in-game as in the real. So much like Baudrillard once called Apocalypse Now, the war is a succession of special effects. Perhaps we can think of Tropico 6 as the colony as a series of cliques. This video game is a direct instantiation of colonial violence, a new temporality within the same space. The simulation is not a simple representation of systems, it is those very systems it at first appears to only represent. One does not pretend to colonize the real, one really colonizes the pretend, the island nation of Tropico and the Tropicans who live there. That's it. Thanks for listening. I'm gonna go play Xbox.